Tahun 2025 sudah di depan mata, tapi tidak seperti tahun-tahun sebelumnya, tak banyak proyeksi yang bisa dibuat. Di akhir tahun ini ada begitu banyak ketidakpastian yang menggantung kebijakan bunga dari The Fed, Bank Sentral Amerika. Kebijakan proteksi yang akan dijalankan Presiden Trump juga dipercaya akan membuat perekonomian dunia bergejolak. Bagaimana pandangan asing untuk perekonomian dan pasar finansial Indonesia? Apakah Indonesia masih menarik? Berikut ini analisis dari dari, Chief Economist IHSG.
I must say there's a lot of uncertainty with which we are stepping into 2025 because a lot of changes could happen globally, in terms of new presidency in the US, things that impact global trade, global growth, commodity prices, geopolitics. So it's sort of a very volatile backdrop with which we are entering 2025. And it would be hard to have very precise forecasts for anything in such an environment because things can change a lot. But if I really try to pick out Indonesia from all of this, I think there are a few things that favor Indonesia. I think one is that a lot of the elections and political uncertainty is behind it because the whole elections happen in 2024. 2025 is a clean slate, a 5-year runway for the new president for his new policies, which I think is a big positive. Second is Indonesia has immense amount of macro stability. Inflation is low. The current account deficit is quite low at this point. The fiscal deficit is under control. So in a way, this really stands out, macro stability, especially when there is global uncertainty. So I think that is also something which is to Indonesia's favor at this point of time. I think one thing that Indonesia has to think about carefully, and which I think is a big challenge, is how to raise growth sustainably. Growth over the last couple of years has averaged about 5%. The aim is to take it all the way to 8%. Now that's very ambitious, but I would say that one of the stepping stones would be 6%. And I think the near-term challenge is how do you take growth from 5% to 6%? And I think that should be the main concern of Indonesia in 2025. How do you really go about doing that? I'm happy to sort of add a few more lines on this, which is that, the obvious ways to raise growth in the short run is by giving rate cuts, monetary policy easing, or by government spending more, which is fiscal policy easing. Now, all of these can help in 2025, but we also need to understand the limits with which they can help. It's going to be very hard for Bank Indonesia to keep cutting rates, policy rates, at a time when we are seeing dollar strength around the world, because that could then impact the exchange rate. So your hands are tied a little bit. You can't cut rates too much at a time when dollar is very strong. So that could sort of limit monetary policy easing to some extent. We do expect 3 rate cuts in policy rates in 2025, but these 3 could be quite widely spread out. They may not be back to back. A lot will depend on what happens to the dollar, what happens to the Fed. So you can't completely depend on monetary policy. And then there is fiscal policy. Indonesia has a fiscal deficit ceiling of 3% of GDP. And if you cross that, then the markets react adversely. So you need to be within that. They're already at 2.5% of GDP for next year. Maybe you can increase over the next few years, but there's not too much you can increase. So monetary and fiscal policy can get you some growth, but it can't get you a lot of growth. To get a lot of growth, which the country needs, I think we need to look elsewhere. And this is where I think trade can play a very important role, diversifying the export basket. If you look at Indonesia's export basket, about 50% is commodity intensive. Oil, coal, palm oil, coal, metals, iron and steel, mostly commodity intensive. which is good because Indonesia has all of these commodities available. But the problem with only being commodity intensive exporter is that you don't see enough backward linkages. You don't get that many jobs. You don't get, you want to take the commodity and make something out of it, and in the process create jobs, create incomes. But if you're only going to sell the commodities, you don't really create the job. And in order to create the job, you need to move up the manufacturing value chain. And I think that is Indonesia's challenge. Right now, 50% of its exports is commodity intensive. Its biggest trading partner is China, where literally 100% of the exports is commodity intensive. So you need to make it more diversified over time. And here I think there are some interesting things happening. I was very interested to see that, when I saw what Indonesia is exporting to the US, it is very different. It doesn't have any commodities. It has manufactured goods ranging from apparel to footwear to small electrical items to some automobile items. In fact, it looked a lot like Vietnam's export basket. So my point is that Indonesia does already have some diversified exports in its system. It's just that it has to be scaled up. It has to be increased. Today, only 9% of its exports are going to the US. It really needs to increase that number. Maybe only 6% of its exports are going to EU. It needs to really increase that number, because to these advanced economies, Indonesia is selling a lot more diversified goods at this point of time. Another very interesting point I noticed is, for example, textile exports. Indonesia sells quite a lot of textiles even now to the US. And if you look at Indonesia's textile exports as a percentage of Vietnam's textile exports, it's about 25%. It's small, but it's not very small. It means that Indonesia has some of these industries already. That's why it's being able to sell these things to, for example, the US. It needs to scale it up. And I think that should be the policy priority. How do you scale up diversified exports over the next couple of years? And it's odd that I'm seeing it at a time the world is worried about, protectionism. Yeah. But I do think that Indonesia has an opportunity for the simple reason that, if because of new tariffs in 2025, many of the countries which have large trade surplus with US come under new tariffs, then there will be a hunt for new set of countries which don't have a large trade surplus with the US and which can now be used to manufacture a lot of goods to sell to advanced economies. And in a way, you can argue that Indonesia did not really benefit in the last couple of years, but in the next couple of years, when supply chains around the world are rejigged, Indonesia could be a beneficiary and get an opportunity to grow its diversified exports. So I would say Indonesia needs to be alert, and a window of opportunity could open up, and it can really try to take this opportunity this time. It's fair that you said I'm positive, because this is how opportunities come, right? Suddenly a big change happens globally, and if you're in the right place in the right time, you catch it and you run with it, right? And I have seen it happen, right? 5 years ago, Vietnam ran with this opportunity. Mexico ran with this opportunity. Maybe Indonesia will get its time. But when it gets its chance, it needs to take it and run with the opportunity. And for that, it needs to be ready. And I don't want to underestimate the challenges in being ready. I think a couple of things Indonesia needs to really get done. One is, continue to do the infrastructure rollout. That is very important. Second, try to work more towards skilling its labor force. Again, that's very important to get manufacturing going. But I think the most important is to have more trade agreements, particularly with advanced economies like Europe. There have been FTAs which have been in discussion for a very long time. You really need to prepare yourself and get it all done very quickly. You have to do your groundwork so that if the opportunity comes, you can run with it. So look, I'm actually not an equity analyst, so it'll be hard for me to talk about the stock markets directly. But I can say that, what I started off with, that 2024 had a lot of uncertainty, right? There was like a big national election happening. That uncertainty is out of the picture. So whenever uncertainty is out of the picture, then, things look good. So I think that is the big positive opportunity for Indonesia in 2025. But the negative part is that the global backdrop is extremely volatile. We don't know what to expect from 2025. We don't know many of the tariff decisions, all of that. It'll only be clear, in January and February and maybe even later. So that uncertainty is sort of not good. So we have some positivity, but we also have some negativity. So I think on the whole, it's going to be a sort of a mixed picture, and it's going to be, something that remains quite volatile, and we'll just have to take it a day at a time. So it's going to be very hard to predict that, things are going to be really good or really bad. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty, but Indonesia is in a better place in 2025 than it was in 2024 because it has, a lot more policy and political certainty right now.